What is up, folks? Jorge Anito here. Thanks for stopping by. Welcome back. Welcome back to the Historical Jesus Fact or Fake playlist, a project where we are taking secular accounts, secular, non-biblical, non-Christian early attestation into account and using those as a basis for the historicity of a guy named Jesus of Nazareth, a guy that we read about in our Bibles. We are drawing nigh to the end of our playlist. After this installment today, there's only 2 episodes left, and the 2 remaining episodes are very interesting indeed. But let's talk about Suetonius for right now. Suetonius, Roman historian. And I'm going to read from a couple different sources here. The first being from Josh and Sean McDowell's work, Evidence That Demands a Verdict, and this is what they gather. Suetonius, a Roman historian, a court official under the Emperor Hadrian. He wrote Lives of the Caesars. Can I say that right without messing it up? Suetonius wrote Lives of the Caesars. And so, and it was published around AD 120, and it describes the events and the lives of the first 12 Roman emperors. Pretty straightforward. In the Deified Claudius, chapter 25 and verse 4, Suetonius writes, "Since the Jews constantly made disturbances at the instigation of Chrestus, he," being Claudius, "expelled them from Rome." So in Acts 18:2, Luke reports this event, which took place in AD 49. Between AD 49 and AD 51, but historians usually date this, and comfortably so, to 49 AD. The Latin word for Christ is Christus, but Suetonius says Chrestus. And now a lot of Jesus mythicists will use this in argumentation. They say that there was a Jewish agitator by the name of Chrestus, which was actually a common name of the time. And so regarding this piece of information, there's a few things that I want to mention. Now it is now there's a historian and author named Harris who writes on this matter, and he explains in an amusing footnote, and this is from Stephen Bancarz' article, Reasons for Jesus. He says that to Greek ears, the name Christus would have sounded like something drawn from medical or building technology, meaning either anointed or plastered. And so the Romans who heard these Jews talking about Christus assumed that perhaps another type of plastering or anointing was going on, so they switched it to the more comprehensible Chrestus with an E. Which means useful one. And this was actually a common slave name. Now Suetonius may well have known that it was Christ, and yet decided to ascribe to him the name Chrestus, which was a common slave name. Now the interesting thing is that, you know, we're talking about some Jewish agitator by the name of Chrestus. Now, is there such a said figure? Well, the thing is, we have no evidence independent of Suetonius' use of this form that a Jewish revolutionary by the name of Chrestus existed in the middle of the 1st century. On the other hand, we have abundant evidence for the existence of a controversial Jewish teacher during that period known as Christus, or Christ. In effect, we have more mythicists. In effect, we have more reason to advocate Christus mythicism rather than Christus mythicism. The Jewish mythicists would have us believe that Jesus Christ did not exist, but that during roughly the same time period there was a Jewish leader who stirred controversy among the Jews and whose name coincidentally happened to be Christus. And as Miller, another author and historian, observes the speculation that there existed simultaneously Jewish zealots known as Christians, is to stretch coincidence a rather far. Is also a little interesting side note that Harris talks about, and this is via a quote from the 4th century Latin Christian Lactantius, that Jesus was commonly called Christus by those who were ignorant, and it was commonly misspelled. And here's the thing. Think about some of the things that we misspell just by accident on a daily basis. And the same thing happened, way back when as well. Take, for instance, Dr. Michael Heiser, whom I admire and look up to and sit under as far as teaching and doctrine and what have you. When I go to search him from time to time in the old Google machine, when I whirl up the old YouTube machine, I type in Heiser. Sometimes I spell it wrong. I spell it H-I-E-S-E-R rather than the correct spelling H-E-I-S-E-R. And it's just a common accidental misspelling, accidental on the part of me, and that seems to be what's going on here in Suetonius as well. This isn't the only piece of data that Suetonius provides. There is another account. This other one does not mention Christ by name, but rather it talks about Christians, and he does spell this one right, and this is what he says. Suetonius wrote about the fire that swept through Rome in 64 AD under the reign of Nero. Remember that we had already talked about this in Tacitus. Suetonius recounts, punishment was inflicted on the Christians, a class of men given to a new and mischievous superstition. Now, this superstition more than likely had to have been the resurrection. What else could it have been? The resurrection is the most controversial thing in a Christian worldview, in Christian doctrine, in the life of any believing person. It was just as controversial back then as it is today. But the point is that he is recounting an event in 64 AD, the Great Fire of Rome. It happened under the watch of Nero, and so Nero, needing a scapegoat, takes this class of men, who Suetonius says is a class of men that was given to this new and mischievous superstition. This idea of a resurrected Christ was upsetting the culture and the way of religious thought at that time. And so, this is what we know in history. Tacitus recounts the event, Suetonius does as well, and therefore we know he was at least somewhat familiar with the sect known as Christians, but he may not have known, or he may not have been as familiar with their leader, Christus, or Christ. And so, just by way of conclusion, this is what Eddy and Boyd say as far as describing the historical value of this piece of data. And it says it's very easy to surmise that Suetonius, or his source, mistakenly understood a riot that had been broken out over the preaching of Christ as being instigated by Christ himself, whom, as we have suggested, he mistook to be the proper Greek name Christus, or the common Greek slave name. While certainty is impossible, at the very least we have here an early non-Christian source that confirms Luke's accuracy about the expulsion of Jews by Claudius Caesar. Guys, Suetonius, I debated doing this because I know how controversial this piece of information is, but this is a cumulative case, right? We're taking various pieces of data and we're compiling a case for the historicity of Christ, and therefore we can't just leave certain things out because they may rub us the wrong way. We need to take everything into account. We need to weigh the facts. That's the reality of it. Guys, I want to thank you for stopping by today. Stay tuned next week for the finale of the documentation part of the historical Jesus fact or fake, and we're ending with the heavyweight, the most controversial and maybe most meaningful piece of secular early attestation of them all. Stay tuned. I think you're going to want to stick around for this, and God bless.